Section 1. Zenith and Shadow. The Soviet Union at its peak. At its height, the Soviet Union was a giant, one of the world's two superpowers. Its influence stretched across the globe from the heart of Europe to the shores of the Pacific. This was a nation built on a powerful idea: communism, a society where the state provided for all. Its military was formidable, thousands of nuclear warheads, a vast army, a network of allies bound by the Warsaw Pact, the red flag with hammer and sickle, recognized everywhere, a challenge to the Western way of life, a different path for humanity. This vast empire covered 1/6 of the Earth's land. It spanned 11 time zones. Its factories churned out steel and tractors. Its scientists launched the first satellite and the first man into space. For decades, it seemed unbreakable. Kremlin leaders spoke with confidence about the future. They believed history was on their side. The ideology promised a world without class, without exploitation. For many, that promise held powerful appeal. The Cold War was the stage for this global drama. The world split into two camps, but even at its peak, shadows were gathering. Strength hid deep-seated problems. The end story began long before the final days, in quiet decay beneath the grand facade. Section 2. The cracks appear. Stagnation and the seeds of discontent. The first visible cracks appeared in the economy. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the engine of Soviet industry began to sputter. The era of rapid growth was over. It was replaced by what leaders themselves would later call the era of stagnation. Factories were old and inefficient. They struggled to produce goods that could compete with those from the West. The central planning system dictated production and quantities. It had become a tangled web of bureaucracy. It was slow to adapt. It was slow to innovate. The technological gap with the United States and its allies grew wider each year. This slowdown hit ordinary people's lives. Store shelves were often empty. Toilet paper, sausage. People waited in long lines for hours, unsure they'd get what they came for. This was daily life for millions. Official propaganda spoke of progress, but the people saw queues and shortages. A quiet cynicism took root. The promise of a better life felt distant. Corruption became pervasive. A privileged class of party officials lived very differently. Special stores, better housing, foreign goods. They enriched themselves and their families. The gap between ideals and reality was vast. People saw this injustice. They whispered about it in their kitchens. Trust in the system eroded. Deep-seated resentment grew. Beneath the surface, nationalism was stirring. The USSR was a collection of many nations. It was made of 15 republics, each with distinct language, culture, history. Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Georgia. Moscow had suppressed these identities for decades, but they hadn't disappeared. As central control weakened, old loyalties re-emerged. Section 3. The Architect of Change, Gorbachev's Reforms. In March of 1985, a new leader came to power in the Kremlin. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. At 54, younger and more energetic than the aging leaders before him. He recognized the Soviet Union was in deep crisis. He believed the system could be saved, but only through radical reform. He introduced two key policies that would change history. First, glasnost, openness, more transparency in government, more honesty in the media, and the culture of secrecy. Glasnost opened the floodgates. People felt they could speak their minds without fear. New newspapers published critiques of the government. They exposed corruption. They exposed incompetence. Historians began probing the darkest chapters, including Stalin's crimes. Banned books and films were released. The openness was electrifying. It gave hope to millions, but it also released long-suppressed frustrations and grievances. The state lost control of the narrative it had told for 70 years. Second, perestroika, restructuring, a plan to reform a stagnant Soviet economy, introduce elements of a market economy, allow some private enterprise, give state-owned factories more autonomy. Goals: make the economy more efficient, more productive, more responsive to people's needs, reduce the massive burden of military spending, pursue arms control with the United States, meetings with President Ronald Reagan. Those meetings helped thaw the Cold War and reduce nuclear risk, but the reforms were a high-stakes gamble. Gorbachev tried to repair a ship in the middle of a storm. Perestroika proved hard to implement. The old bureaucracy resisted. Short-term economic chaos followed, prices rose, shortages sometimes worsened. Instead of revitalizing the system, reforms exposed its fundamental flaws. Gorbachev hoped for a more humane, effective socialism. but opening the door unleashed forces he couldn't control. He aimed to reform the USSR, and inadvertently began its unraveling. Section 4. The stirring of nations' nationalism on the rise. As the grip of the central government in Moscow loosened, the spirit of nationalism surged across the Soviet republics. The policy of glasnost gave a voice to long-suppressed national aspirations: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These nations had been forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940. They had never forgotten their brief period of independence between the two world wars. Huge, peaceful demonstrations took place. In August 1989, an estimated 2 million people formed a human chain, the Baltic Way, stretching across all three republics to demand freedom. The Caucasus region also erupted in turmoil. In Georgia, massive pro-independence rallies filled the streets of the capital, Tbilisi. In April 1989, Soviet troops brutally suppressed one of these demonstrations, killing 20 people. This tragedy only hardened the resolve of the Georgian people to break away from Moscow's rule. At the same time, a bitter conflict broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Ancient ethnic tensions, long frozen by Soviet power, exploded into open warfare. The Kremlin seemed powerless to stop the violence, further undermining its authority. In Ukraine, the second most populous republic, a powerful independence movement known as Rukh gained momentum. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986 had already sown deep mistrust of Moscow. Now Ukrainians began to demand greater sovereignty. They pushed for the Ukrainian language to be given official status and for more control over their own economy. The idea of a separate, independent Ukraine, which had seemed like a distant dream, was rapidly becoming a political reality. The unity of the Slavic heartland of the Soviet Union was beginning to fracture. Mikhail Gorbachev was caught in a dilemma. He believed in preserving the Soviet Union as a single reform state. He tried to negotiate a new treaty that would grant the republics more autonomy while keeping them part of a federation. But for many, it was too little, too late. The nationalist movements were no longer asking for more rights within the Soviet system. They were demanding a complete break from it. The winds of change blowing through the Soviet Union swept across Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, communist governments loyal to Moscow, backed by Soviet troops. Gorbachev made a fateful decision. He signaled the Soviet Union would no longer use military force to keep these regimes, a radical departure from past invasions. Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 1968. He was, in effect, letting them go their own way. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Poland. Solidarity re-emerged. Solidarity won a stunning victory in June 1989. Hungary. Reformers dismantled the border fence with Austria. Thousands of East Germans vacationing in Hungary escaped to the west. The trickle became a flood, creating a crisis for East Germany. Change moved at a breathtaking pace. The iconic moment, November 1989. A confused government official announced travel freedoms on TV. That night, enormous crowds at the Berlin Wall. Border guards opened the gates. People surged through, cheering and crying. They climbed the wall, chipping it with hammers and chisels. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a televised revolution. Pure joy. The fall set off a chain reaction. Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution. Bulgaria's communist government fell. Romania, violent end. Ceausescu and his wife executed on Christmas Day. By the end of 1989, the Soviet Union's external empire in Eastern Europe had vanished. It had a profound psychological impact inside the USSR. If Eastern Europe could break free, why not the republics within the Soviet Union? The dominoes were falling faster than anyone had imagined. As the Soviet Union's external empire crumbled, a new and critical power struggle was emerging at its center. Mikhail Gorbachev, President of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin, leader of the Russian Republic. The two men were once allies, but they became bitter political foes. Yeltsin was a charismatic and populist figure. He had been a high-ranking communist official. He broke with the party establishment, criticizing the slow pace of reform and the privileges of the elite. He presented himself as a radical Democrat, a man of the people fighting against the old system. In June of 1990, the Russian Republic declared its sovereignty. This meant Russian laws would take precedence over Soviet laws. In June 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of Russia in the first popular presidential election. That election gave him a powerful democratic mandate. Gorbachev, by contrast, had been appointed by the Communist Party and lacked that mandate. Yeltsin used his position to challenge Gorbachev's authority at every turn. He argued for a faster transition to a market economy. He also pushed for more power for the individual republics. The conflict became the central political drama of the Soviet Union's final years. Gorbachev tried to hold the Union together, seeking a new, voluntary federation. Yeltsin focused on building a new, independent Russia. He saw the Central Soviet government as an obstacle. The struggle represented two different visions for the future. Gorbachev wanted to reform the existing house. Yeltsin wanted to tear it down and build a new one on the Russian part of the foundation. The power struggle paralyzed the central government. As they fought, the economy continued to decline. Authority drained away from the Soviet state toward republic leaders, especially Yeltsin. The fate of the Soviet Union rested on this intense political battle. The breaking point came in August of 1991. A group of hardline communists decided they had to act. The vice president, the prime minister, the head of the KGB. They were horrified by Gorbachev's reforms. They feared the new treaty he was about to sign. It would grant significant powers to the republics. It would effectively dismantle the old centralized Soviet state. While Gorbachev was on vacation in Crimea, they launched a coup d'état. On the morning of August 19th, they announced Gorbachev was ill and declared a state of emergency. Tanks rolled into the streets of Moscow. The plotters expected the people to be submissive. They were wrong. Thousands of Muscovites poured into the streets to protest. They surrounded the Russian parliament building, the White House, to defend Russia's elected government. The defining moment? Boris Yeltsin climbed onto a tank. He condemned the coup as illegal. He called on the people and the military to resist. His bravery galvanized the opposition. The image of Yeltsin on the tank was broadcast around the world. It became the symbol of resistance to the old guard. The coup was poorly organized. The plotters were hesitant and indecisive. They failed to arrest Yeltsin. Many army and KGB units refused orders to storm the parliament. Soldiers were unwilling to fire on their own people. After just 3 days, the coup collapsed. The plotters were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow to a very different country. The coup had destroyed his authority. While Gorbachev was a prisoner in Crimea, Yeltsin had become the hero who faced down the tanks. The failed coup was the final fatal blow to the Soviet Union. The Communist Party was discredited and soon banned. One by one, the republics rushed to declare full independence. The central government had no power left to stop them. Gorbachev tried to hold things together, but it was hopeless. The coup meant to save the Union had guaranteed its destruction. It accelerated the process that led to final dissolution months later. By the winter of 1991, the Soviet Union existed in name only. The real power now lay with the presidents of the newly independent republics. On December 8th, Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus met secretly at a hunting lodge in a forest called Belovezhskaya Pushcha. There, they made a historic decision. They signed an accord stating that the USSR is ceasing its existence. They announced the creation of a new, much looser alliance, the Commonwealth of Independent States. This was the final act. The leaders who had founded the Soviet Union in 1922 had now officially dissolved it. They did so without consulting Mikhail Gorbachev. He was now a president without a country. When he heard the news, he was furious, calling the move illegal. But there was nothing he could do. The military, the KGB, and the government bureaucracy were all now answering to Boris Yeltsin. The world watched as the once mighty superpower simply evaporated. The process of collapse, which had taken years to unfold, was now reaching its swift and quiet conclusion. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev gave a final, televised address to the nation and the world. He spoke with a tone of sadness and resignation, but also with some pride in the changes he had brought about. He defended his reforms, arguing that they had brought freedom and ended the Cold War. He warned of the dangers ahead. After his speech, he signed the decree that transferred control of the Soviet nuclear arsenal to the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. He had formally resigned from a post that no longer existed. A few hours later, in a quiet and somber ceremony, the red Soviet flag was lowered from its flagpole above the Kremlin for the last time. In its place, The white, blue, and red tricolor of the Russian Federation was raised. The moment was not marked by celebration or violence, but by a strange and profound silence. After 74 years, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially over. It did not end with a bang, but with a whimper. The world map had been redrawn. 15 new nations were born from the ashes of the fallen empire, and a new era of history had begun. The consequences of the Soviet collapse were immediate and profound. The end of the Cold War brought relief and a new, uncertain landscape.